Well, let's switch across to Ukraine, and we're going to go straight into two little video clips from Channel 4, a report from in the trenches at Kramatorsk, and this was by the Channel 4 journalist Lindsay Hilsum. Now, I've got to say that this lady has put herself in the front line, and we have to give her absolute credit for that. But let's have a little look at part of the report. We've taken this out of a slightly longer report. Let's have a look at it and see what she has to say.
The outgoing machine gun fire from the Ukrainians is aimed at suppressing the Russians so they don't fire back. But the problem is that as long as there's firing from this position, there could be firing coming into us. And that's why we're waiting here in this trench and not moving.
3, 2.
After a few minutes of quiet, it's time for us to run across the open ground to the other trench. All safe. And now down into the safety of the soldiers' sleeping quarters, which are warm and cosy, a necessity, not a luxury, because they need to keep kit dry. And Vadim has a companion.
We have a friend. No.
Olyenka, the kitten, is just 2 months old.
She is a good warrior.
She's a good fighter.
Mouse.
Oh, she gets the mice.
Yeah.
Life in Ukraine will be tough this winter, and nowhere tougher than the trenches of Donetsk. The risk is only too clear. But Ukrainian soldiers know why they're fighting and what they must endure to win. It's perfectly possible that this trench warfare is going to continue through the winter without either side making any notable advances.
Well, my point on this, of course, relatively quiet area of the front, so the public watching led to believe that that is the situation on the front, whereas the reality on the front is absolute bloodshed and carnage, particularly around Bakhmut. But the scene is being set that this is going to be a long war. Yes, of course, because NATO is desperate to keep the war going and pump in the arms. And she's quite happy with that situation, it would appear. So let's look at the second part of the clip with this particular lady speaking.
And you know, here in the background right now, even in Kramatorsk, I can hear the rumble of artillery. It's not clear how far away it is. Now, there's a NATO foreign ministers meeting tomorrow, and what they're going to concentrate on is the other threat, which is the Russians who are firing missiles at Ukraine's energy sector. That's the reason that so many towns in Ukraine don't have power, and some of them still don't have water. A lot of places they haven't managed to restore that yet. So what NATO countries are likely to do is provide more air defences, as well as generators and transformers, other things that will make civilians' lives just that little bit less difficult. I can't say easier over the winter. But even as that is going on, the men you saw in that report, Vadim, Yuri and others, are going to be in those trenches fighting. And so are the Russians. The Russians who are their equivalents, many of them conscripts, the poor bloody infantry, and their kit may be worse and they may have less discipline. And discipline is one of the things you need to survive a winter in the trenches. Now, in 2022, just as it was more than 100 years ago in another part of Europe.
Well, there we are, and very quickly, of course, we've got in that the Russians are incompetent in what they're doing, but this is just static warfare on the front, whereas the truth is completely different. But let's have a look at how Ben Wallace has been manipulating things in Ukraine. And I came across this really, I find it an astonishing picture of Ben Wallace with President Zelensky. Picture says 1,000 words. What do you pick up from this one, Mike? The devious little conversation with an unkempt, I'd call him dishevelled Tory salesman, Ben Wallace. What's he selling? Well, he's going to be selling more arms. He's going to be selling more war. He's going to be selling more death. But I was interested in that very interesting expression of the lady looking at the I believe it's an aide. I'm going to ask you for some help on this one, Alex, but I look at this picture, it disgusts me because this is the manipulation behind the scene to keep this war going and to keep thousands of casualties, possibly 1,000 casualties a day running. What's your impression of this little gathering, Alex?
Well, I think you also should ask Charles Mallet, a Sandhurst graduate, because I do get the sense from that gentleman's profile and smirk that he's an army officer. I'm perfectly willing to be corrected here, but something like an adjutant or the equivalent at the MOD. And these men do always, the defense secretaries, when they travel, do have these aides on hand and, giving them their talking points. And when I interpret, I see this as well. The permanent secretaries and the advisors are actually running the show, and the secretaries and ministers are there really to stand here and say this as directed by these guys. So, whether the joke originated with Wallace is possible, but it may have been more likely that the gentleman you just drew attention to is really keeping a closer eye on proceedings than just there to support Wallace.
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. Well, let's bring that image back on screen and have a look at what the real headline was. British Defence Minister calls on the Ukrainian Armed Forces to maintain the pace of rapid attacks on occupiers throughout the winter. Well, the reality is that as a result of this sort of advice, small groups of Ukrainian soldiers without any form of armoured vehicle, with no air support, are attacking Russian positions, and they are being slaughtered in their thousands. So that despicable little meeting with a very scruffy Ben Wallace, but what's the result? Ukrainian and Russian soldiers going to die. These are some of the things that he said. Given the advantage that Ukrainians have in training and the quality of their personnel compared to the demoralized, poorly equipped and trained Russians, it would be in Ukraine's interest to maintain the momentum gained during the winter. It would be in Ukraine's interest to keep the war going, but the reality is that Ukrainians are on the defensive at the moment, and their limited attacks are being destroyed with incredibly heavy losses. The country's a wreck. There's no momentum forward, but there is momentum into a completely failed state. So well done, Ben Wallace. He went on, the Russians recently deployed a unit with no food, no socks, and few weapons. This is a disaster for a person who goes into the fields. Now, I'm pretty sure what we've got here is Ben Wallace repeating Ukrainian propaganda, but it's cheap, it's ridiculous, and it's outrageous that he should be uttering these sorts of words for UK and Western ears to hear. He said this, the Russians have the scale, but they are not great. Well, most of those who were good soldiers are dead. Is this almost wishing that the only good Russian soldier is dead? Is this what this man is saying?
Quite possibly, but even if there was any truth to that statement, if that's the case for Russia, what's the case for Ukraine?
Well, indeed. Well, I've just put a banner over that slide, Mike, because the reality is that the Russians have deployed strategic and tactical weapons which have got technology, and they're being deployed on a scale that the West is unable to counter. So this is quite a ridiculous statement by Ben Wallace. And this one here, only a nation that does not care about its own people can send 100,000 of its people to die, be wounded or desert. And the reality is that if there's 100,000 casualty figure, this clearly applies to the Ukrainians and not the Russians. But we're getting the overall impression that Wallace is happy with the killing fields, and his objective with this little conversation, and others of course, which he has on a regular basis, is to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. But of course the BBC is helping, because all of a sudden Bakhmut, where the main fighting is taking place at the moment, has dropped off the BBC map. Social commentators are commenting on the importance of Bakhmut, as of course they should, but the BBC, if you go searching for it, you're looking at old reports. So the BBC does not want to report on the reality of what's going on. A better photo, I'm not sure where this has come from, so thank you for whoever the person was who took it, But basically, Ukraine is now talking about a tenfold increase in dead and injured. So that Channel 4 report at the beginning giving completely the wrong impression of what's happening. And this would mean, a tenfold increase would mean possibly 1,000 dead Ukrainians a day. Meanwhile, Mike, I think you're going to show the suits who are the people helping keep this war going.
Well, indeed, as Lindsay Hilsum said in her report, the foreign ministers meeting of NATO taking place yesterday and today in Bucharest in Romania. So they're discussing their long-term objectives for enhancing NATO's defences. They're strengthening their support for Ukraine, apparently, or at least they're talking about how they're going to do that, and they're talking about how they're going to enhance their long-term resilience. Now, Finland and Sweden are there. This is their first foreign ministerial meeting as NATO invitees, and this is ahead of their accession to the alliance. That means that their membership takes NATO to 32 countries. So no expansionism going on there at all. Moldova is joining the meeting at foreign minister level for the first time in history, and the foreign ministers of Bosnia and Herzegovina and also the foreign minister of Georgia also to be present at this meeting because they're discussing their ongoing cooperation with NATO. So I just wanted to show this still from the NATO sort of press pack, and I just think Jens Stoltenberg, well, gormless is the word that springs to mind there, Brian. He does not look competent, and in fact his actions demonstrate that he's not competent.
He's also looking jaded, Mike. I think the pressure is beginning to tell, but you don't want anybody who's too bright. You just need the puppet who will stand up and make the report that the really powerful people want. So I think Stoltenberg is beginning to fail here.
Yes.
Okay, well, let's come back on the scene of the war. A couple of days ago, we reported on the BBC, which had a statement about NATO. And what did it say? It said this, that NATO is not training Ukrainian soldiers or providing Kiev with military support as an organisation. Now, we said this was an absolute ridiculous claim because it's quite clear that NATO is doing everything it can to assist this war. But before we comment further, let's have a look at this little video clip of the Ukrainian Foreign Minister, Mr. Kuleba, speaking.
Iris, Hawks, Patriots, and we need transformers. When we have transformers and generators, we can restore our system, our energy grid, and provide people with decent living conditions, which President Putin is trying to deprive them of. When we have air defense systems, we will be able to protect this infrastructure from the next Russian missile strikes, and they are definitely to come. Unfortunately, this is the reality that we have to prepare for. So, in a nutshell, Patriots and Transformers is what Ukraine needs the most, and we're discussing it here in Bucharest at the NATO Ministerial.
So this says it all. When you've got a need, you go straight to NATO, but NATO claims it isn't really involved. But what a ridiculous request, that over 50% of the national electricity infrastructure destroyed, and you're now going to get portable generators to solve the problem. This is a report from Radio Free Europe. NATO chief expects allies to step up air defence to support Ukraine. Well, this is pure rhetoric because the West, whether it's the US or UK, NATO or the EU, has run out of weapons in volume and capability. This is obvious. It's being reported in many places by national media as well as international media, and so presumably Jens Stoltenberg doesn't understand what's happening, Mike.
Well, and indeed, as we mentioned on Monday's programme, Ben Wallace acknowledging that fact. Alex has a comment. Have we got time?
Please do.
Yes.
It is not just weapons that the West has run out of. Heads of state and government in Western Europe are now openly saying we have run out of space and we have run out of money for Ukrainian support. 12 of the 16 Bundesländer, federal states in Germany, are not taking in any more Ukrainian refugees. Did you see that reported in the BBC?
No.
Well, no, of course not. Well, let's bring Jens back up on screen, because another headline here: NATO foreign ministers set to address more support, and he's talking about rebuilding the Ukrainian power system. But of course, at the moment, the Russians are targeting that deliberately to undermine the Ukrainian war effort. And what does Stoltenberg think is going to happen if any of it is repaired? It's going to be destroyed again. So once again, we showed this as well, but this is how he's being ridiculed on social media, and quite rightly so. But let's have a look at wider cooperation with NATO. And if people go to the NATO site, we start to see amazing things here. So in this particular paragraph, we're talking about building Ukraine's capabilities and interoperability with NATO forces. So to say that there is no partnership between Ukraine and NATO is simply ridiculous. But if we go down, we see a whole plethora of different initiatives, different sorts of warfare, command and control. And this really shows how big this interaction with Ukraine is. And of course, the assistance is both lethal and non-lethal. If we, well, okay, that makes the claim not credible, which we've already said. But we can also go in this direction, where NATO appears to also be handling funds. And we've got a number of different trust funds here. If we pop this one up on screen, this is to do with getting rid of weapons and mines, which was apparently happening back in 2010. But if we follow it through, although there's claims that NATO has been helping to demilitarize Ukraine, the reality is clearly false, because if we come to this segment where it's talking about butterfly mines, Ukraine has been using these in the battle in the Donbass, and so clearly NATO has failed on this particular funded program. But this is where it becomes very interesting. Are we just dealing with NATO, or are we dealing with an embryonic one world military system? Because here's partners within NATO cooperation. Leave people to have a look at the nations listed on screen, but a great number of them. Or we could go to another group, which is partners across the globe. Or we can come into NATO's Mediterranean dialogue and the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. So it appears that really we have a world military system coming together under NATO, and it's very easy to see this from their own documentation. Social media commentators coming in here, pointing out that, of course, the Ukrainians just expecting more and more supplies to come in. And they're also pointing out that, of course, if NATO puts in more weapons, even if it's got their own operators with it, those are going to be destroyed. But it's not only the weapons, it's soft loans. And this was some detail from Ukrainian news. And let's have a look at the figures here. A loan of up to 100 million euros in that particular one. And if we follow through here, we're talking about $3 billion a month. We're talking about a 2.5 billion macro financial assistance from the EU, 2 billion of macro financial assistance from the European Union as a result of a different program, 500 million euros, and at the bottom, 1.5 billion which has come from the trust fund of the World Bank. And if you think that must be enough to satiate Zelensky, you're wrong. Let's have a look at this little clip.
Для мене честь представляти українську кандидатуру на проведення Всесвітньої виставки 2030 року. Представляти Одесу, а отже і увесь Чорноморський регіон. Чому саме Одеса? Чому саме Україна? Чому саме Чорне море? Цьогоріч Україна стала світовим взірцем сміливості. І мільярди людей на усіх континентах побачили, що означає українська незламність і чому російський терор не досягне своєї мети. І побачить, як Україна стане взірцем відбудови. Ані зимовий холод, ані темрява, ані будь-які інші прояви терору не допоможуть Росії підкорити українців. Прийде час української перемоги, а тоді відбудова нашої держави стане найважливішим економічним, технологічним і гуманітарним проєктом нашого часу. Вже зараз ми залучаємо десятки країн-партнерів до відновлення України. Загальний обсяг робіт понад $1 трильйон. Коли у 2030 році ви відвідаєте Україну та нашу Одесу, ви зможете відчути силу, свободу і культуру не просто однієї країни і одного міста. Ви відчуєте потенціал усього людства.
So, Alex, I'll just come back to you on that. Is that a comedy script? Is it a comedy script? I'm not sure, but $1 trillion, it would seem to fit with all the other evidence we've got.
It's about 3 registers below formal Ukrainian. He's not a native speaker. He made a big deal of that before he was elected president. He was saying, can us Russian speakers be left alone to live in peace in this country? His choice of words is odd in Ukrainian, talking about nashu Odessa, our Ukraine. And that gravelly voice, I know he's got his wartime act, but, you know, he's sounding like one of these Soviet-era singers of balladi there, you know, give me my smoke and let me out of the clink. It's a particular gravelly voice he's putting on to be a hero. Of course, he specializes in entertainment. But no, I think that was not directly scripted for him, but he has in mind certain Soviet-era sort of gulag folk hero singer models in his mind as he reels off his patter.
Okay, well, we don't know whether $1 trillion is reality. Is that clip real? What we do know is that if we look at all the other documentation, vast amounts of money being pumped into Ukraine together with the arms, and very little over control, very little oversight over what has gone where, be it the weapons or the money.
Alex,